Hello and welcome back to Tianjin. I'm delighted to be joined by Karen Ortenstein from Friends of the Earth US. Maybe we should start with a little look at the US role in these climate negotiations, having just had the Venezuelan Special Envoy for Climate Change here. She pointed the finger at the US and said, this is a country which is still standing in the way of progress in a way. Is that an interpretation that you could agree with?
Yeah, I would agree with that interpretation. I do think the U.S. is standing in the way of progress. The U.S. is in a difficult domestic situation where our politics back home are somehow in the Stone Age, or maybe in the pre-2000 age, or pre-climate crisis age. And so, for example, many members of Congress the U.S. Congress don't even think climate change is real. And because of domestic politics not moving forward, the U.S. is trying to block negotiations here. And so it's ultimately, it can't deliver at the international level because of domestic problems. And so it's, in a way, saying, well, because we can't deliver internationally, nobody can deliver internationally. And instead of leading a race to the top, which the U.S. is not at the point that it can lead right now, it wants to drag everybody else down to its level.
And what's the answer then in terms of that? Is it that we need to be really focusing on activism within the US and at a domestic level, or is it that the US simply needs to step out of the way and allow other countries to move forward, and indeed if other countries would go forward without the US taking action, where does this leave us?
Well, I mean, I think you've pointed to actually a couple of the solutions. First of all, we do need a lot more action in the U.S. domestic process, but there are a lot of things, for example, that the Obama administration could do without the U.S. Congress, because the U.S. Congress is arguably less progressive in many ways than even the Obama administration is. There's the Environmental Protection Agency that has a lot of regulatory authority that it could use if it wanted to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, for example. At the same time, in the international process, we do need the U.S. to step aside and admit, well, we're not where most of the rest of the world is at, and there was a special carve-out for the United States under what was called, that came up in the Bali negotiations in 2007. It's the Bali Action Plan, and there's a special carve-out in the Bali Action Plan basically for the United States to put its greenhouse gas reduction commitments, because it had not, and most likely anytime soon will not, ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol can continue without the United States. Countries don't need the U.S. to do that. The U.S. isn't going to move forward right now. It's way too unambitious mitigation commitments that it's talked about, 3 to 4% below 1990 by 2020, which is in no way comparable to what it should be doing. It can park those in the Bali Action Plan, and other countries can continue under the Kyoto Protocol. And this is really a time for the EU to pick up the mantle of climate leader, the mantle they used to have, and somehow they're not rising up to the task right now.
So do you feel that if the EU upped its kind of ambition and said, we're going to commit to 30% reduction in emissions on 1990 levels by 2020, do you think other countries would follow, other rich countries would follow their lead?
Well, first of all, I would say that there's discussions of the 30% below 1990. That's too low. Mm-hmm. But say, for example, they did say 30%, or what they should be doing more, 40 or 50%. There'd be leadership. There'd be a race to the top and not a race to the bottom. I think so. And the EU is a big economic force in the world today. And if the EU did it, I think there's a reasonable chance that Japan would follow, for example. But right now, everybody's somehow waiting for the U.S. to act. But the U.S. isn't going to act right now. And the world sort of has to acknowledge, or not, I shouldn't say the world, but other developed countries have to sort of acknowledge that that's where the U.S. is at. It's unfair, but they shouldn't wait for us. And we, as people living in the U.S., have to work on hammering back home to get our government to act and implement the things that they can do even without Congress, but that the world absolutely cannot wait for us in that respect.
I guess a lot of developed countries would point towards inaction in the US and say, hang on a second, we're going to be at an economic disadvantage if we constrain ourselves to a certain level of emissions, and US industry is allowed to continue emitting huge quantities of CO2. The flip side of that coin we've been hearing here in China is that actually some countries are getting a little bit ahead of the US when it comes to some of the new green economies and some of these booming industries, with whether it's renewables or whether it's batteries. Is there a danger that the US is going to fall behind in terms of the new green economy?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to continue to rely wholly on fossil fuels, we're going to be in the fossil age. In the U.S., I mean, it's true that we are putting ourselves, us meaning the U.S., at a competitive disadvantage if we're living in a very much a climate-constrained world. The future is not with fossil fuel technology; it's with solar and wind, and it's we're seeing a lot of what China is doing right now. And it is true this is going to have repercussions for the U.S. down the line, but I would also want to characterize things as we need to approach this actually as we're all in this together, that we need a greater spirit of cooperation rather than competition. And so it's not, U.S. versus China, whether or not who's ahead. It's that the global warming is a global crisis, and it's going to impact farmers in China, and it's going to impact farmers in the U.S., and it's going to impact farmers in Malawi. So we have to sort of have a paradigm shift of how we're thinking about this.
Before I move on, I want to talk to you a little bit about climate finance. But before I move to that, it seems that there's a real desperate need for domestic activism in the US and for a big movement there to move the politics forward. What signs are there for that? Because we've just seen the legislation that Obama was hoping to achieve fall through. We've got elections coming up, which I know that the climate change is a contentious issue, and he's being hammered on that. So are we going to see any progress in the next year, the next 2 years? I mean, how long does the world have to wait before the U.S. politics is going to progress?
Well, Obama has said that it is a priority for him, so I will see what happens with that. But he still maintains it is. There is going to be movement with regulations under the Environmental Protection Agency, and there is movement on the ground. It's too slow, but for example, the group 350.org is having a worldwide mobilization on October 10th, 10-10-10. There's many actions planned for what's happening in the United States, and there's a lot of frontline communities in the United States that are impacted now by various environmental threats that are really starting to mobilize, but it's taking time, and I think it is a problem that people aren't feeling the impact today, as opposed to trying to talk about something that's going to happen in 10 years, 20 years. They're not necessarily attributing things to that now. There's movement. It's too slow, but there's movements. And that's what, Friends of the Earth as an organization, Friends of the Earth US, is trying to help build that movement as a progressive force in Washington, D.C., working in coalition with grassroots groups around the country. But yeah, we have a lot of catching up to do.
I'll just say to our viewers, if you're tuning in for the On the Hour news, I'll bring that to you in 10 minutes or so. I just want to move on now and talk about climate finance is kind of how it's termed here. Maybe you've got a better explanation for it. But what is the role of money in these talks, basically?
Well, the negotiations sort of hinge on two things. First, deep greenhouse gas reductions by developed countries. Second, finance, and that means developed countries are obligated to provide funding for developing countries to adapt to the unavoidable impacts of climate change. People call it adaptation, and to enable developing countries to mitigate, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and to embark on clean development pathways, because the atmosphere simply can't handle developing countries industrializing on coal the way, for example, the United States did. So climate finance, as it's called, is absolutely critical to these discussions.
And a lot of people have been telling us that it's not only important in itself in that it's going to help poor countries adapt and that it's going to help mitigation efforts, it's also really important for the process. It kind of lubricates the process because of trust. Is that a reasonable interpretation?
Yeah, it's all about trust building. Developed countries have made all these promises and they're not fulfilling them, so why should developing countries have faith in what they're doing? That applies to mitigation and that applies to climate finance.
And I guess an obvious question for a lot of our viewers might be, why should we pay for other people to adjust to the impacts of climate change? People in the US or in the developed world work hard for their money, and they get taxed, and maybe they're looking at their healthcare system and saying, well, that's not so great at the moment, and then this money is being sent to somebody in Senegal who's struggling with really severe coastal erosion. Why is there a responsibility, do you feel, for rich countries to help poor countries adapt to climate change?
Well, it's pretty simple. Developed countries cause the climate problem. If you think that, for example, you crash your car into somebody's house, and then you think the owners of the house should have to pay for the damage done by the house crashing into the car, by the car crashing into the house. I mean, it's that same principle. It's the idea that polluters pay. That BP, for example, that's responsible for the huge oil spill in the Gulf in the U.S., that they are responsible for cleaning up their mess. Well, developed countries made this mess, and we're responsible for cleaning it up. And that doesn't mean that the governments, for example, the U.S. government's not also responsible for helping out its citizens, but it has to do that as well as helping out developing countries, because they didn't cause this climate crisis, and it's incredibly expensive to deal with.
And what you say it's incredibly expensive. What kind of money are we talking about? I know that the pledges on the table are not even meeting those that have been promised. And I think, if I'm right, is it 30 billion that's been promised over the next 3 years as kind of this immediate fast start funding, and then up to 100 billion a year by 2020. Is that enough?
Oh, my goodness, no. The estimates of the need are far higher. Their magnitude's higher. They're hundreds of billions of dollars a year starting now, let alone what's out in the future. So basically, whatever we don't do now, we're going to pay for magnitudes multiples greater in the future. So the less we mitigate now, the more it's going to cost for countries to adapt later. And it's going to be more expensive to mitigate later. So no, the numbers on the table are way too low. For example, the $30 billion, that's an arbitrary political number. The $100 billion that people are talking about by 2020, that's not commensurate with what science demands, and it's absolutely not commensurate with what equity demands.
So what kind of money are we talking about? Martin Core earlier from the South Centre, we sat in on a press conference with him, and he was saying 500 to 600 billion. Does that sound more realistic? And if that does sound more realistic in terms of the costs of dealing with climate change, is it realistic in terms of what rich countries are willing to give?
Yeah, I would agree with Martin's assessment. And I mean, we just spent trillions to bail out banks. So can't we spend trillions, or we're talking about a lot less than trillions, to bail out our planet? So I mean, it's actually not expensive if you compare it to what we spend to save our financial sector. For what benefit? That's questionable. So, and where's the money going to come from? Well, I mean, some of it will have to come from countries' budgets, etc. But there has to be now more attention focused on what's called innovative sources of climate finance. So sources that people don't normally look at, like a financial transaction tax, or there's this thing called special drawing rights under the International Monetary Funds. There's all these sorts of things that are out there as possible public sources of revenue that have different constituencies fighting for them. They just have, and they're technically feasible. We have to develop the political will to implement them. But that's, in a time of global recession, we're going to have to look at, taxing bunker fuels, or a carbon tax that generates revenue both for domestic action and for international action.
Okay, and just before we finish, perhaps we should say where's climate finance, or where's the money question here in terms of the talks? Like, is it one of the more advanced issues? Are we kind of hoping to achieve something by the end of the year in Cancun?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the two hinges of the negotiations. So by Cancun, we hope to have a decision to establish a global climate fund where, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where developed countries would deposit their money that would then be used for developing countries, and it would be under the control of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there was discussions on that in negotiations today. They were behind closed doors. I don't know exactly what happened, but it's a huge issue.
So hopefully we'll see progress. Well, perhaps on that note, Karen, we should leave it. Thanks for covering two very different topics there, the kind of domestic situation in the US, and also unravelling some of the mysteries of climate finance for us. And perhaps we can catch up with you later in the week when it's a little bit clearer how these talks are going. So thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.